Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today's guest is ecologist and conservation biologist Tim Killeen, who has spent over 30 years living and working in South America, where he was influential in the creation of some of the first protected areas in the Amazon region, as well as the first environmental impact study conducted in Bolivia. His unique experience working at the forefront of satellite mapping helped pave the way for how we study deforestation today. In recent years, he's written about the drivers of deforestation in the Amazon, the economic and logistical hurdles to curbing it, and put it down in a book which is now in its second edition, A Perfect Storm in the Amazon Wilderness. Mongabay is publishing the book in installments in English, Portuguese, and Spanish for free. The latest edition of the book brings us up to date on the state of the Amazon in 2023, deforestation drivers, and pathways forward for protection, a complex subject that Tim digests into a concise and highly recommended read. I'll be linking the chapters we've published thus far in the show notes. In our conversation, Tim summarizes some key points for readers and listeners, advice for the new generation of conservationists, and also what gives him hope. We begin our conversation talking about what he calls a turning point early on in his career that eventually led him to work in Bolivia, and it all began with an overland journey from Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego back in the 1970s. So, hi Tim, welcome to the Mongabay newscast. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Nice to meet you, Mike.
Nice to meet you too. And where are you joining us from?
Today I'm in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. It's a relatively large city on the southern edge of the Amazon in the Bolivian lowlands. I used to live here. I'm visiting again after being away for a couple of years. But I lived here for 25, 30 years, so I'm very comfortable here. I have lots of friends. And so I'm here taking care of loose ends in my personal life and, of course, working. I work from wherever I'm at. I'm lucky that way.
And you have been quite a lot of places. So I, before we get into your book and all that stuff, I just want to ask a little bit about this trip from Alaska that you took down to Tierra del Fuego. So you said that this journey, it kind of inspired a career change for you. What career change was that exactly?
Well, yes, it very much so. And so before we were very much, both me and Susan, my wife, later who would become my wife, we were both hard scientists, but lab scientists or applied scientists. And we were young in our careers. So we had plenty of time to make alternate decisions. And so she decided, after spending a year and a half in spectacular places like the Galapagos Islands and Patagonia and the Cordillera de Huaylas, which is in the central Peru near Huascaran National Park, it was it was eye-opening that there was so much nature out there. Of course, we both of us had grown up camping and backpacking and canoeing and stuff like that, so we were predisposed to do this kind of stuff. And we decided that we wanted to pursue careers that way. So Susan, who comes from a family with a long tradition of bird watchers, decided she would become an ornithologist. And because my research up to that point in genetics had been focused on wheat and its relatives, barley, rye, oats, all those crops, I decided that I would become a botanist and I would specialize in the tropical grasses. So that's how we got there. Kind of a random walk through life. You make one decision and then you make another. Each decision influences the next one down the path, and so you end up where you end up.
And so then after that, you went and got your PhD after that, correct?
Right. It took a while. I mean, that was a very long, interesting trip. And then it kind of made us free thinkers as well. So we came back to the United States and kind of researched around where we might want to do our graduate studies. We had to start kind of over in graduate school because, you don't go from agronomy to botany without, covering some new ground. And so we chose Iowa State University, which was convenient for us because we're from the Midwest. Susan from Wisconsin, I'm from Kansas. It was a nice place to be, and they had professors that appealed to us. My major professor was a botanist who spent his life working on the tropical grasses and used Costa Rica as his laboratory. So that was easy. And so we went there and immediately started thinking about how we could get ourselves financed to do research in Latin America, preferably Bolivia, because we had these contacts there. And we got fellowships from the Organization of American States that funded a significant part of our research. And they were like 2-year fellowships, like if you were going to go study in a school someplace. And so we overlapped them and we spread that out into 3 years and then stayed a little bit longer because we could. And so our field program was actually 4 years long rather than, usually people doing a PhD, they go to the field for 2 weeks in August and September, or maybe 2 months, and then they come back and teach classes, and they do that over 3 or 4 years, and they get a PhD. Well, we disappeared for 3.5 years into the Bolivian forest, and just had a wonderful time. Our first child was born down there, and then came back in the late '80s. Virtually middle-aged by this time, and and started looking for work.
Yeah, not to get ahead of ourselves. So I was going to ask, you how the transition, to Bolivia came about, and so can you talk to me about this period in which you lived in Concepcion in Bolivia? You described it as a really formative period for you. So is that what happened when you did your 3 years down there, or did that come later on?
No, that was then, and of course, when you ask people for money, you have to spin them a tale, right? And so, so we said, oh, we're going to go into the Bolivian lowlands, and I'm going to do research on tropical grasses, and Susan was going to study a couple of bird species that she thought was interesting, and we selected a point. A town in the lowland, a small city and university in lowland Bolivia was willing to respond to our letters asking for collaboration. You have to be able to convince people that what you're doing is useful, so they can give you money. And again, it was a lot easier in the 1970s or the 1980s than it is now. And so we were funded, and on my first tour around Bolivia, I was on my way to this little village, to this city that had the university that was willing to sponsor us. When I went through Concepcion, I took a little trip up there. I was looking for ideal places to do research. And so as we were coming into San Javier, which was the next town, I guess, west of Concepcion. So I'm heading east into the highlands, the Brazilian Shield Highlands, and up towards the Amazon in Bolivia. And there was this fellow, running down the road, a local indigenous fellow, and he had a dead lion on his back. He had a dead puma that he had just hunted someplace. And then later on, when we got to Concepcion, they immediately started telling me about how there was this troop of wild peccaries that had just gone through and had messed up the airport, and the airport was closed down for a day or something like that. And so I said, well, but this is wildlife. And so I kind of decided that Concepcion was the right spot. And it's an old town, but it's been completely surrounded by forest until just recently. Now, of course, it's suffering from all the deforestation issues that areas were. But back in the 80s, it was still, the forest came right up to the edge of town. We had natural savannas. It was Cerrado savanna, which is a type of Brazilian savanna that's very rich in grasses. So that was appealing to me. Lots of wetlands, which different kinds of grasses, but also attracts lots of birds. And so lots of interface between the forest and the savanna, which natural interfaces. So you get to see, a lot of ecological succession. You see more diversity because you see forest birds, savanna birds, and things like this, and a charming place.
You sort of mentioned this in your interview with us that back in the 80s, sort of like a shift started to happen where the issue of biodiversity and deforestation came to the fore. So I was a kid in the 1990s, so I have no before and after to compare to this to, because to me, culturally speaking, growing up in the 90s, deforestation was at the forefront of everything. I grew up watching TV shows like Captain Planet and movies like Fern Gully, and so it was almost like this cultural movement of sorts. So I was going to ask you what changed exactly in the 1980s going into the 1990s that put the issue of biodiversity and deforestation on the map, so to speak?
Well, I think it was technology. We finally got satellite images that would cover large spatial areas, so you could visualize the deforestation. I mean, it's one thing to have a picture of somebody cutting down the forest, but it's another thing to have a satellite image year after year after year that shows that it's 100 kilometers squared, then it's 1,000 kilometers squared, then it's 2,000 kilometers squared. So you see this expansion, linear geometric expansion of deforestation to go along with the photos. Of course, then that's the same time they were starting to, monitor fires. They had different tech, and it was, so technology drove a lot of that, and of course, in the late 1980s, that's when suddenly the American NGOs, like the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and Wildlife Conservation International, that's when they suddenly decided that they were going to have international programs. And so they rapidly hired people and staffed offices in all these countries, and they were seeding local NGOs. For instance, the Nature Conservancy, their philosophy back then was that they needed a national partner that had legitimacy within local politics and society. And so if there wasn't one there, they quietly searched around, found the right kind of people, and gave some money so that they would create one, and work quite well. And so other WWF, they just okay, no, we're going to have our offices, and so they have more of a hierarchical program. The America's office, the Bolivian office, the local offices, and they all report upwards. And so each NGO had its own business model, but they all got very active in the late 1988, 1989, and so it was employment opportunities for people. I ended up working for the Missouri Botanical Garden because I was more interested in the science, but there are a whole lot of people who were interested in conservation and advocacy, and so of course that was when people were starting to think about protected area networks, and so which was a stimulus to the NGOs doing this, but also a product of what the NGOs were doing, because they were talking about these things in local media markets and having their partners tee it up, and so this was all happening. Prior to that, in the 60s and the 70s, we had the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Waters Act. And that was focused on bringing, these terrible chemicals like DDT and under control. And, there was, Save the Whales. That's from the 70s. And so there was a big focus on endangered species, partially driven by laws and the way the U.S. laws were, and because there was this tremendous traffic of skins, leather goods, and of course live parrots. We used to know a family that made a living off of collecting and selling live parrots overseas, the big colorful ones, and it was legal. All right. And it was legal in Bolivia longer. It was legal than any place else. And I think in Bolivia, they finally said this is illegal in about 1986. And it took them another decade to get it under control. But they did get it under control. And now the trade in endangered species, and it's still occurring. Now it's like, it's still occurring because it kind of piggybacks on the drug business. And now we have China. China is coming in, and the Chinese have a big deal for odd animal parts and ivory and skins and stuff. We haven't quite convinced the Chinese to come on board with conservation yet, although we're making headroads. Somebody has, not me.
And so you mentioned that you just alluded to this earlier, but you mentioned that during this time was when protected areas started to be created, and you were actually training people to work in the field. You mentioned that to us in a previous interview, and I was just going to ask you, what was that like to be part of that process of being part of like some of the first protected areas, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was a multi-level process that was going on, and so in the 80s, there just wasn't many people around. The universities didn't even have biology departments, and so most of these people were self-taught. There were a lot of people who were very passionate about conservation. And first national parks are almost always created by some person who won't take no for an answer. All right, and that was certainly the case in Bolivia. We had a couple of these guys who, and then Noel Kemp, for instance, who just he was a self-taught elderly gentleman. He was a school teacher. He came from an influential family that helped him certainly, and he just we have to have these national parks, and he just pursued it, and talked to the local politicians and stuff, and got it on their agendas, and what would happen typically, the Congress would convene as, okay, yeah, there's your national park, without any money, without any park guards, but at least you had something there on paper. Many times they were in remote areas, or they were a mountain. The first national park in Bolivia, I think, was Sajama, which is this giant volcano on the Chilean border. And it kind of just protects itself by being a volcano. And so that was going on. And so we kind of went into this vacuum. And of course, they want you to teach courses. They want you to advise students. It gets kind of hard to turn down. When I came back as a permanent employee in the 1990s, I had a budget. When you're a graduate student, you can just, hey man, I'm a graduate student, let me do my thing. But when you came back with a formal job, you kind of have to step up to bat and do some of these things. And so I started in 1990. I organized a group of botanists, and we started working on a guide to the trees of Bolivia, Guia de los Árboles de Bolivia. And so that was a formative experience for them. It was the first time any of them ever had participated in a research institution. They were all students in their early 20s. And by then I was in my early 30s. And so it was challenging because, they didn't have the same level of educational background that a graduate student has in the United States or Europe. But I was throwing them a task that we normally expect a graduate student to do. So it was challenging for them. It was frustrating for me, but we got it done. And most people consider that to be a landmark publication. And what really influenced it, there was the 30 kids that I was working with. I think almost all of them decided to be professional biologists botanists at that point. Some of them went on to zoology and things. And then later on, we organized more projects, and then they had students, and those students had students, and suddenly you have a population boom. And so now there's literally hundreds of biologists in the country, and botanists, zoologists, entomologists. And I was visiting the museum the other day, and a very encouraging, collection that we helped, and we started in 1990. I think there were maybe 15,000 plant specimens. Now there's, 200,000. Wow, that's cool.
Another landmark that you worked on, you had mentioned to us, is that you worked with NASA on mapping deforestation in Bolivia, which I believe at the time was one of the first ones done in South America, correct?
Right. I mean, the satellite image is, Landsat, which was the first a relatively moderate resolution satellite, went up in 1985 or 1986, and so, or no, actually in the late 70s. But the first several iterations were just, it came out on film. All right, you had to have paper. It was yeah. I remember looking at those were from like the early 80s, but then from starting about 1986, and then Brazil got a receiving station, and NASA got their act together. We've started having these digital versions of this stuff, and then they made software for managing it. And so by the time I got to Bolivia in the early 90s, there was some pretty good technology available. And there was a guy at NASA named Jim Tucker, who was a pioneer in all of this stuff. And I think his first paper in Science about deforestation in Rondonia, which is the area just across the border there, must have been about in 1988 or 89, but he got an award for it. And so the next stage was, let's get systematic about it and do whole areas, let's do the whole Amazon. Why not? We can do it. And so they started, and they chose Bolivia as a place to get going, is because it's very far south, and the Amazon means you have an extended dry season, which means that you have access to cloud-free imagery, which then was very important. Now they have all this now we have multiple satellites taking on different days, and now they have the ability to make composite images. Back in the day, you had to have a single image. all right, from a whole, what they call the seam. And if it had more than 10 or 50% cloud cover, it was useless. Now they can take each pixel and they align them perfectly, and they standardize the reflective values, and then they can make a composite imagery from, like, 6 or 7 days of images. And so, the technology is great. But back in the day, it was more work, and they chose Bolivia to start because of the lack of clouds. And someone said, "Hey, go talk to Tim Killeen. He's down there. He'll help you." And so they showed up on my doorstep one day with a bottle of whiskey and said, "Can you help us?"
Just NASA just showed up to your door and said, "Can you help us map Bolivia?"
Yes, actually, that's how it happened.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, Tim, so let's talk about your book. Okay, so this is A Perfect Storm in the Amazon Wilderness, now in its second edition. And you're sort of bringing us up to speed on the state of the Amazon in 2023. I was wondering if you could talk about, are there any key points or themes that you can summarize for our listeners? Like, where are we exactly?
We're in a bad spot. This is the second edition, basically. I published the same thing in 2007, a much smaller version. And what it did then, we took infrastructure, so highways and dams, looking at their, what drives them, what their impacts are. Agriculture, both cattle agriculture and industrial agriculture, which means soybeans in this part of the world. Logging, the impact of climate change. We were beginning, we knew what climate change was in the 1990s and in the double aughts. Everyone else is just catching up, but we certainly knew back then. The scientific community knew how serious it was, and so we were looking at all, and people were starting to model it, and so the economics of it and the policy edge of it, the idea of the national park system was still consolidating. The issue of indigenous territories. These were all issues that were being dealt with separately in each different country. So I brought them all together in a single publication, looked at all the issues at the same time, at all the countries, so that you could see where things connected, because you got to connect the dots. And land values are linked to road access and the ability to farm soybeans or beef. Those things are all come into play when you look at real estate. And real estate is they've cut down the forest and they may grow cows, but they're not making any money on those cows, not for the first 10 years or so. What they really make money is when they sell the property 10 or 15 years later. Then they go, something they got for free, they can sell for a couple of $1 million. That's when they really make their money. So putting all these things together is what makes my approach unique. It was unique in 2007. It's not so unique now. Other people are doing it. But now they're doing it in teams. You'll get a team of 200 people trying to address these issues because they're complex. Where I'm trying to do it all by myself, and it's taking longer in one head. But I think a little experience, and I'm semi-retired, so I can do this. And I think my perspective is a little bit more grounded than some of our friends in academia who are very passionate, very intelligent, perhaps a little bit overly optimistic, and maybe naive about what's happening in the Amazon. So I'm trying to bring this perspective in, and so we cover all the issues. If I'm being a glib, my book is about is everything you need to know about the Amazon if you want to save it. All right, it's not everything there is to know about the Amazon, but I think I'm trying to hit all of the salient points of what has worked and what has not worked, so that we can think about where we go next.
Right. And is there any, again, I don't want to give anything away here, but is there anything you want people to go think about going into while reading this book, which we're publishing?
Well, read the first chapter. The first chapter, which is online, it's available in the 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and it's there complete. And it's an overview. And so, if you want, if you don't have time to read the whole book, and it's a big book, so it'd take a time. But the first chapter is an overview, and it covers all of the major topics. Whether what's the conventional economy about? People want to talk about the forest economy. They want to talk about the indigenous people. Well, I got news for you. There's only 2.5 million indigenous people in a population of approximately 50 million people. All right, and the GDP of the forest economy is only maybe 2.5% of GDP, and everybody else is doing something else, and it's not typically good. All right, or good for nature. It's good for them. That's why they do it. They make money. They support their families. They're sending their kids to college. They're building a house. They're getting ahead in life, and that's going on. And I think we need to understand what drives those people to do what they do. If we expect to convince them to do more of what we want them to do as conservation scientists or conservation advocates, or the people concerned about indigenous affairs, those are very legitimate topics. We have a moral imperative to support the indigenous people. We pushed them through a genocide, and we've stolen most of their land. So anything we can do for them, I think we're just obligated to do that. But we need to think about the 20 million small farmers out there trying to make a living by cutting the forest down. How can we change their behavior? And so those are the kind of things I talk about.
So you also mentioned in that first chapter that climate change threatens the Amazon through the modification of precipitation regimes, which could trigger like forest dieback. So how would that occur exactly? And do we know when that would occur?
No, we don't. We have models. We don't know how. We have an idea how. We have a pretty good idea how. But we certainly don't know when, although we have some models that indicate that, it's just around the corner. And there's a large degree of uncertainty because there are certain aspects of the Amazonian climate that are quite stable. For instance, the water comes from the Atlantic Ocean and it moves over into the forest and then starts to recirculate, runs into the Andes, and then kind of gets shifted south. And so these sets up these regional patterns for the movement of water, which they're now calling atmospheric rivers, or there's this other thing called the South American monsoon that talks about how the dry season shifts north and south depending upon the angle of the planet with respect to the sun. So you have the rotation of the planet and the angle of the planet in comparison to the sun. So those are kind of stable, right? Those things are just kind of always going to happen. What's changing then is land cover. And so in the southern Amazon and eastern Amazon, we have a lot of deforestation, and what our micrometeorologists or our climatologists have shown is that when, the forest certainly, recycles that water. Is someone who did an isotope study way back in the 90s shown that by the time, the water leaves the Atlantic and by the time it gets down to Bolivia, it's been recycled twice. No? And so and it's being recycled through leaves on trees. I mean, it can be recycled through soybeans, but not nearly as much, not nearly as efficiently. And so there's, the link between conserving the forest and conserving these water movements. And now south of here, you got lots of people make a living growing stuff, in southern Brazil and Argentina, Paraguay, you have lots of farmers who grow lots of food for different parts of the planet. And so they're dependent upon this water that comes out of the Amazon, without a doubt. And they know that. Everybody knows that. And so, the danger is that through increased deforestation, you may impact that water flow. And of course, you have some people who are worried about a tipping point where it might suddenly drop, from 100 units to 60 units or something like that. But even if that's not the case, even if it's just declines by 1 or 2% per decade or something, that's a lot of water, and they're going to have very large economic impacts. And so we need to understand more about that. And certainly, removing forest cover is not going to do any good with respect to that. And restoring forest cover or finding crops that are, false forest plantations. A lot of people don't like plantations. If they meet a global commodity need and they restore forest cover and help restore evapotranspiration, I'm willing to consider them as part of the solution myself.
So this is actually getting back to something you alluded to earlier in the previous question I asked, but you say in this first chapter, meaningful reform is impeded by the predominance of conventional business models reinforced by deeply ingrained cultural attitudes, corruption, and inequality. So there's a lot we could talk about here, but I was wondering, can you elaborate for our listeners on what exactly those conventional business models are exactly that you're referring to?
Well, I described it earlier. You You go out and get a piece of land. The land with forest on it is only as valuable as the lumber on the trees. Once you take the lumber out, the forest isn't worth anything. No, and most of that timber, there's not a whole lot of timber that has a great deal of value and is very slow growing. So you can actually remove the timber very quickly and end up with a forest that has no economic value in a conventional economic system. But if you knock down the forest, all right, and grow some grass on there, that costs you maybe $500 or $600 per hectare, maybe $1,000 per hectare to do that. Then you could put some cows on there, and they'll start producing 200 or 300 kilos of meat a year, and that has value to a person. All right, and that's what drives people. All right, and then they're speculating on the land. If the land is good, they can grow soybeans, and that's going to give you thousands of dollars per hectare. And so it's just money, and so it's land speculation. If I'm an engineer, I want to build a highway, and so I'm going to vote for highway budgets. I have 30 people working for me; they're going to vote for highway budgets. We all have cousins; they're going to vote for highway budgets. The people who live out there in that small town, they want a road; they're going to vote for highway budgets because they want to sell their cows. And so you have all of these vested interests that are dependent upon conventional, whether you're growing cows or soybeans, or even if you're trying to conduct a tourist operation out there on a lake. If people can't get there affordably, you don't have it. So you find even a lot of tourist operators are in favor of road building because airfare is very expensive, and that's going to reduce the number of people who get there, and small airplanes are dangerous, etc. And then you go into, the mineral industry, whether it's oil or gold or iron ore. Let's leave gold out of it for a while, but oil, it's nasty stuff. We don't like it. It's bad for the climate. But a country like Ecuador, they absolutely depend on oil. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. They're in my book. But $10 billion a year or $20 billion a year, and that's like 80% of their export. Well, Ecuador's not so bad, maybe 60% of their export income. But if they don't have that export, and if they have problem, if they're importing more than they're exporting, pretty soon they don't have any cash, and they can't buy medicines. They can't, import the things they need for their industry. And so it's really important for the macroeconomic stability of these countries to be able to exploit these minerals. And so, there's, some are, now everyone's talking about rare earths and lithium and other types, copper and stuff. And well, they're in the Amazon. And so how are we gonna, these are part of the conventional economy. Every time you get in the car, turn on your iPhone, you're using some of these minerals. And or if you're in an air-conditioned house, you're driving a car that's not electric, et cetera, you're using these minerals. And so the people who run these countries, the politicians, we'll call them statesmen if you want to be nice to them, but they have real macroeconomic needs to get this income from someplace. And so if the only option they have is exploiting their mineral resources, they're going to do it. And because if not, they're going to lose the next election and be out of a job. This is the way the system works. It works in the United States this way. It works in Australia that way, if I'm not mistaken. And so it works down here too. And, people are responding to those types of pressures, which are everyday economic needs at the micro scale. Can I make money growing corn over there or beef? And if you're a president, what are my needs this year to balance my budget?
So you point out that changing the pathway of the Pan Amazon is like turning an ocean liner, which is an analogy I thought was really great and interesting to use. And you say that pressure must be applied to the rudder of state over a long period of time to drive change. So I want to ask you, what is a place right now that you want to see more pressure applied to? Is there any low-hanging fruit that we could take action on globally that seems like an obvious win to you?
Yeah, the most obvious is just remove the incentive to cut down the forest. All right, and so there's ways to do that because most of the forest is coming down either by cattlemen or by smallholders who are, trying to make a living. And it depends on where you're at. In Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, they're largely smallholders. In Brazil, there's kind of the big guys are very, very effective. In Bolivia, you get both. Um, eh, and so, like you have to be very clear to the soybean supply chain and the beef supply chains. Hey, we have technology now. We can trace your supply chains, and we're not going to buy your stuff if it has any deforestation with it. And so they'll clean up their supply chains. They'll pretend they can't, or but they can. And there's technology for do that, and it's extra cost, but it's the cost of doing business. And of course, we need China and India to come along with us, because right now they don't care. All right, China doesn't care whether the soybeans comes with deforestation free or not. In Europe, the United States grows their own soybeans. Europe imports about 20% of Brazil's harvest. That's a lot, but that's nothing compared to China. And so we need to get China to come in on these things as well. But anyway, to get them to reform their supply chains, and also to and then the small people, who are very important. If it's about votes, you need the smallholders, because they're the ones who can win an election for you. And so what is it that they need? They need some kind of a production system that's not based on deforestation. They cut down forests so they can grow crops, so they sell it so they can eat or stuff. But maybe acai, maybe plantations of acai, or some plantations of palm that can produce some type of tree-based commodity. It's a perennial. It's good for transpiration. It usually the way the smallholders, they have more diverse land holdings. You get a big corporate guy who says, okay, 10,000 hectares, in soybeans. Well, a small guy, he's only got 100 hectares. He's not going to risk his whole livelihood on just one crop. So he'll have a more diverse agroforestry production scheme, just because of the psychology of a small farmer. And so we have to help them. And the small, people always go on about the big guys, but the smallholders hold 25, 30% of the land. And so if we really focused on them and provided them with alternative ways to make money that were based on growing trees and paying them a fair price for their product, which means we have to make sure the product has a global market. Don't expect them to be happy breaking even growing, whatever, tropical fruits of some sort. No, they need a global commodity for which there's demand, for which people will pay them real money. Coffee, cacao, acai. There's a variety of palm things out there that make vegetable oils that have different uses and stuff. So there are crops, and even timber. There are crops that these small guys can grow that will help them make more money, and so we change their behavior. And then you get these big guys over here. Well, some of it you have to do with just like supply chain management. Say, look, you guys, if you want to sell to us, you need to obey the law. All right, and the law says you need to have 50% of your land cover in natural forest. Well, we're gonna guess what we're gonna run. We're gonna run. We got satellites now. We're gonna check that this is the case. So if you want to sell to us, you need to tell us who your suppliers there are, so we can identify them. And because we now have maps of land holdings, so we can identify them. Of course, it's all very confusing, and nobody tells you who owns what. They're doing all kinds of non-transparent things in the name of privacy. And so, which is legitimate privacy. We're all concerned about privacy. And so, those are the kinds of things that might bring some kind of change of behavior. And, that requires somebody, with the power of taxation, or who, has a environmental prosecutor who could go after someone who's illegally deforesting or invading indigenous territory. And then we haven't even talked about gold, which is just this giant mess out there. And with the, a very informal, it's almost as bad as cocaine. Gold and cocaine I put in the same category.
We could talk about that for quite a long time. So given the news has been pretty bleak recently, and given everything you've seen in the Amazon, I was wondering if you could tell me what gives you hope. You mentioned to us in an interview that you have to remind people of success. So what are some things that give you hope?
Well, we've been very successful in paralyzing the road industry. Back in the 70s, 80s, they were driving roads all over the place. And so, starting in the 1990s, there was pretty much a paralyzation of the expansion of the road network. Now there's been a uptick since about 2000 in improving the roads that exist. All right, and so that has kind of a collateral impact of expanding stuff. But We did manage to say, oh, no, you're not going to build these roads. And so that's an ongoing fight, one worth having. And then, how much improvement to the roads are you going to take? Because once you pave a road, boy, you're going to get a lot more development. Once you can drive down that road, there's one between Porto Velho and Manaus. Where they want to pave. If they pave that, there's just going to be, there's going to be development along that road. And so, we've had success in opposing ridiculous infrastructure. There was a time when they were building dams all over the place, and it's a sustainable energy, it's renewable, but it's also terrible for the organisms that live in the water, and the people who fish and live on those organisms, and sometimes they're even bad business investments. And so one of the biggest successes, I think, is that the last big dam to be built was Belo Monte, and it was finished maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I think Bolsonaro inaugurated it. It started with Lula. And so, it took like 15 years to build it. But there's no new ones on the board. All right. Someone, not me, I'm not important, but the people who study dams and their economics have said, hey, look, you spent $5 billion building that dam. And, it's not going to operate at full capacity. It's not going to pay for itself. The company who built it's going to go bankrupt. It's a bad investment. And in Peru, there's one of their presidents, Alan Garcia, had made a deal with Lula back in the day when everybody loved each other. And they were going to build 9 dams, big, massive dams, as large as Hoover Dam on these massive rivers that come out of the Andes, which generated, 10 gigawatts of electricity that they could have exported to Brazil, and Brazil can buy everything they need, they can export. But, the environmentalists, they attacked the first one and they tore it apart based on its economics. It was not viable. All right. And so that was a success, and nobody's even talking about the other 9. It's just, they're not even talking about them. It can come back to haunt us. These things never die. They just go away for 10 or 15 years, and then some other government will come along and propose them. So there have been a successes, and of course, the big success is the protected area system. It works. Study after study after study shows it works. Deforestation in a protected area is less than deforestation outside of protected. Everybody's concerned about the deforestation inside the protected areas. They're sneaking in there. They're going after gold and stuff like that, stealing the wood. Same thing in the indigenous territories. But there's a reason. Deforestation is not high inside a protected area because it's been taken off the land market, and the indigenous territories have been taken out of the land market. The indigenous people aren't successfully defending their land. They need help, certainly, to keep the wood thieves out and the gold thieves out. But the fact that it isn't being colonized and deforested massively is because they've been removed from the land market. And so me as a colonizer, I have no incentive to go in there and spend, tens of thousands of dollars creating a ranch that I can't sell because nobody will buy it because I don't have papers, and everybody knows I don't have papers. It's these areas where there's questions about who owns the land. Right? Along every highway, there's this big area. Oh, that's state land. That's public land. Right? And so, okay, but I have papers. See, I have papers, and they may be fake papers, but I have papers. And so I can sell you this. I'll buy it. I have papers. And every time you sell it, you give that paper more legitimacy, et cetera. But in an indigenous land or a national protected area that doesn't allow settlement, there's some protected areas that allow settlement, they have problems. You kill the land market, and that's what actually protects them. So there's a variety of things that we're doing right. So we need more protected areas. There's still 25% of the Amazon that hasn't been allocated to anything. They're out there in the middle of the Amazon, and Brazil just said, well, we'll wait a few years, see what we do with that. No, and so that's a fight worth having.
So my last question for you, Tim, is if you had one piece of advice to give to conservationists in the younger generation who are just starting out, what would that be? Is there anything that you learned that you wish someone had told you when you first started?
Oh, I don't know. I guess, learn economics. All right. Learn about how the real world works so that you can come up with viable solutions, and I guess be innovative. I guess we need some of that Silicon Valley startup venture capital helping our people in the forest. We have a situation where the people who are trying to generate new models of doing business in the forest, they all work for NGOs. They're not venture capitalists. They're not entrepreneurs. So what we need more entrepreneurs in the forest, so to help us figure out how we can make viable businesses out there, whether it's selling it cosmetic goods, or it's a new type of tourism, or it's helping to build a sustainable supply chain for acai, which I think has a great amount of potential. Things like that, and better forms of communication. Of course, anything kind of educational for the people who live there is certainly needed. So conservation biology, I guess I believe in diversity. All right. That's one of the great things about being a conservation biologist. You understand diversity. So we need lots of different people doing lots of different things. So we have, a diversity of ideas about what we do next. But I think everybody should take a good, healthy course in economics, so you understand why that scheme that you really want to grow, nuts in the forest, it won't necessarily work unless you have someone who's going to buy it.
All right, Tim, this was a highly informative conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, you're welcome. And thank you for looking me up and asking me these questions. I enjoyed myself.
If you want to read Tim's book, we are releasing it for free in installments on Mongabay. The first 2 chapters are linked here in the show notes, so check it out. And as always, if you enjoy the Mongabay newscast and you want to help us out, you can spread the word by telling a friend about the show, because that is the best way to help expand our reach. But if you want, you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. As we are a nonprofit news outlet, even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms out there, including Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Mastodon, Threads, and others. There's so many of them out there at Mongabay. Thanks as always for listening.